What if the Roman Empire's greatest shame wasn't its brutal gladiator games or public executions, but something far more sinister happening behind closed doors? While historians celebrate Roman civilization, law, and culture, they often skip over one of the empire's darkest institutions: the systematic exploitation of young boys kept as personal servants by Rome's elite. These weren't occasional scandals or isolated incidents. This was an organized, legally protected system where children as young as 10 were bought, sold, and trapped in lives of servitude. From senators to emperors, Rome's most powerful men collected teenage boys like precious objects, using them for their darkest desires while society looked the other way. The Roman Empire didn't just conquer territories and build roads, it built an entire economy around the abuse of children. The evidence, buried in ancient texts, reveals horrors that make modern crimes pale in comparison. Roman male concubines occupied a specific and disturbing position in the empire's social hierarchy, distinct from regular household slaves in both purpose and treatment. While typical slaves performed domestic duties, agricultural work, or skilled trades, male concubines served one primary function: satisfying their owners' intimate desires. Roman law made a clear distinction between these personal servants and other categories of human property, with different legal protections and market values. The term concubinus specifically referred to a male slave kept for intimate purposes, though Romans also used puer delicatus, meaning pleasure boy, or catametus, derived from the mythological Ganymede. These weren't adult relationships between consenting partners. Roman concubines were typically acquired between ages 10 and 16, with 12 being considered the ideal age for purchase according to surviving slave market records. Roman law technically prohibited the assault of freeborn citizens, but slaves had no such protections. The Lex Scantinia, passed around 149 BCE, attempted to regulate intimate conduct, but its protections only extended to free citizens. Male concubines, being property rather than people in Roman legal thinking, fell outside any meaningful protection. Their owners could abuse them without legal consequence, sell them to others, or even kill them with minimal legal oversight. The practice wasn't hidden or shameful among Rome's upper classes. Wealthy Romans openly discussed their concubines in letters and dinner conversations. Pliny the Younger wrote casually about friends who kept beautiful boys for entertainment. Martial's epigrams referenced the intimate use of young male slaves as commonplace household arrangements. This wasn't underground behavior, but accepted social practice among those with sufficient wealth to afford such luxuries. The economic value of male concubines far exceeded that of regular slaves. While a typical agricultural slave might cost 2,000 sesterces, an attractive young concubine could command 50,000 sesterces or more. Their value depended on physical appearance, age, education level, and intimate experience. Virginity increased their price significantly, as did cultural background, with Greek boys commanding premium prices due to perceived refinement and education. Roman households often maintained multiple male concubines simultaneously, creating competitive hierarchies among the boys. Senior concubines held slightly better positions, sometimes overseeing newer acquisitions or managing their owner's intimate schedule. This system created internal dynamics of survival and collaboration among victims trapped in the same horrific circumstances, forced to navigate relationships with both their abuser and fellow victims. The supply chain feeding Rome's appetite for young male concubines operated through multiple brutal channels, each representing different forms of human trafficking that would shock modern sensibilities. War captives provided the largest source of new concubines, with Roman legions specifically targeting adolescent boys during military campaigns. When Roman armies conquered new territories, commanders allowed soldiers to claim young captives as personal property, but the most attractive boys were reserved for officers and eventually sold in urban slave markets. Military records from campaigns in Gaul, Germania, and Britain document the systematic capture of teenage boys, who were then transported in chains to major slave trading centers in Rome, Alexandria, and Ephesus. These boys faced forced marches of hundreds of miles, with many dying en route from exhaustion, disease, or suicide attempts. Survivors arrived traumatized, malnourished, and completely unprepared for their fate. Debt slavery provided another steady stream of victims. Roman law allowed creditors to seize children as payment for family debts, and poor families sometimes sold their own sons to survive economic hardship. These transactions were legal and common, with standardized contracts specifying the child's age, physical condition, and intended use. Parents rarely saw their children again after such sales, and boys sold into concubinage faced particularly grim futures since their intimate value meant they would never be freed through typical slave advancement paths. The slave markets themselves operated with clinical efficiency that masked their horrific purpose. Professional slave dealers maintained detailed catalogs describing available boys, including physical measurements, intimate experience, and special skills. Buyers could inspect potential purchases through degrading physical examinations that constituted assault. These inspections included verification of virginity, assessment of physical development, and evaluation of compliance and docility. Prices varied dramatically based on specific characteristics that buyers valued. Virgin boys from noble families captured in war commanded the highest prices, sometimes exceeding the cost of luxury villas. Physical beauty increased value, but so did education and cultural refinement. Greek boys were particularly prized for their supposed sophistication, while Germanic captives were valued for their exotic appearance and physical strength. The procurement networks extended throughout the empire, with specialized dealers developing expertise in different regional markets. Some focused on war captives from frontier campaigns, while others cultivated relationships with impoverished families willing to sell children. Professional slave hunters even operated kidnapping rings, targeting vulnerable boys from rural areas where disappearances might go unnoticed. Transportation of young concubines involved additional trauma and abuse. Slave ships crammed dozens of boys into cargo holds designed for goods rather than humans. Many dealers allowed crew members to abuse the boys during transport, reasoning that the experience would make them more compliant for future owners. Boys who resisted or attempted escape faced severe beatings, branding, or deliberate scarring that would reduce their market value as punishment. The entire system operated with legal sanction and social acceptance that enabled its horrific scale. Roman citizens saw nothing wrong with purchasing children for intimate purposes, viewing it as a normal luxury for those with sufficient wealth. This normalization allowed the trade to flourish openly, with slave markets advertising their human inventory alongside livestock and household goods. Let's talk about what daily life actually looked like for these boys inside the walls of a Roman elite's home. Forget any ideas of luxury or pampering. These kids lived in a world built around their owners' every whim, with routines and punishments designed to break their spirit and keep them compliant. Most Roman households that could afford male concubines set them up in tiny, bare rooms just steps away from the master's private chambers. The idea was simple. Keep the boys close, always available, but never let them forget they were property, not family. Privacy was a luxury these children never knew. Usually, several boys would be crammed into a single room, making rest or emotional recovery nearly impossible. Every day was a cycle of anticipation and anxiety. The boys knew they could be summoned at any time, day or night, for whatever their owner desired. Their lives revolved around a strict schedule, not of their own making, but meticulously crafted by the household to maximize the owner's satisfaction. Some boys were assigned to specific days or even hours, like a grotesque entertainment lineup, and were expected to be freshly bathed, groomed, and mentally prepared for whatever was demanded of them. But it wasn't just about physical compliance. Owners expected their concubines to put on a show, to act delighted, grateful, even enthusiastic, no matter what was happening. Failing to convincingly perform happiness came with serious consequences. Punishments ranged from beatings and starvation to public humiliation or even permanent scarring. Some owners went as far as branding their boys, marking them for life as a warning to others and a reminder of their status. The psychological manipulation was relentless. Owners deliberately isolated the boys, forbidding them from forming close friendships or confiding in other household staff. Any sign of distress or unhappiness was punished, as it threatened the illusion that these children were willing participants. Over time, many boys lost their sense of self entirely. Some stopped speaking, others turned to self-harm, and a few developed coping mechanisms that today we'd recognize as dissociation, mentally escaping their bodies during abuse just to survive. Education, when it was provided, wasn't about helping the boys grow or develop skills for the future. Instead, it was designed to make them more entertaining for their owners. Some were taught music, poetry, or conversation, anything that could enhance their value as companions during intimate encounters. It was a cruel parody of childhood learning, where every lesson was just another tool for exploitation. Medical care was similarly twisted. Household physicians were there to keep the boys healthy enough to serve, not to heal them as people. Injuries or illnesses that affected their appearance or performance were treated promptly, but psychological trauma or non-visible health issues were ignored unless they threatened the boys' usefulness. Inside these households, hierarchies developed among the boys themselves. Senior concubines might get slightly better treatment or be put in charge of managing the others, but this only created more stress and competition. Instead of banding together, the boys often found themselves vying for scraps of favor, desperate to avoid the worst punishments. This system of internal rivalry was no accident. It was a deliberate strategy to keep the boys isolated and less likely to resist. Some boys, in a desperate bid for survival, developed emotional attachments to their owners, a phenomenon we now call Stockholm Syndrome. Roman writers, observing these trauma responses, sometimes claimed the boys actually enjoyed their situation, completely missing the reality of psychological survival mechanisms at work. The long-term effects on those who survived and eventually gained freedom were devastating. Many struggled to form healthy relationships, suffered from chronic depression, and lacked basic life skills. Years of captivity and abuse left them psychologically dependent on structured environments, unable to function in situations that required independent decision-making or personal agency. Now, if you think this was as bad as it could get, the imperial palace took things to a whole new level. Here, the practice of keeping male concubines became an institution, supercharged by the unlimited power and resources of the Roman emperors. The scale was staggering. Some emperors maintained private harems of hundreds of boys, turning the palace into the epicenter of systematic child exploitation. Take Emperor Decius, for example. Contemporary sources describe his Garden of Boys, a collection of over 300 male concubines, each carefully categorized by age, appearance, and even their specializations. The palace kept detailed records tracking each boy's performance, physical development, and compliance, treating them like livestock with clinical precision. The process for selecting imperial concubines was just as disturbing. Professional slave dealers, who specialized in serving the emperor's tastes, scoured the empire for the most beautiful and desirable boys. They paid top dollar to snatch up the best candidates before they ever reached public slave markets, sometimes spending more on a single boy than an ordinary Roman citizen would earn in a lifetime. Emperor Trajan became infamous for his appetite for beautiful boys, reportedly keeping over 200 concubines in specially built palace wings. The boys were organized into themed groups, each representing a different conquered territory. It wasn't just about personal pleasure. This was a twisted display of Roman dominance, a way for the emperor to show his power over both the bodies and cultures of the empire's newest subjects. The training these boys endured went far beyond what happened in private homes. They were taught not just to please, but to perform elaborate role plays, impersonate mythological figures, and act out historical or fictional scenarios tailored to the emperor's fantasies. This allowed the emperors to dress up their abuse as cultural or religious rituals, further blurring the line between entertainment and exploitation. Emperor Commodus, never one to be outdone, introduced even more elaborate systems. He established a rotation so he'd never see the same boy twice in a month, and kept detailed lists specifying exactly what he wanted from each boy, down to physical traits, personality quirks, and even specific behaviors. The palace became a living menu, with children as the main course. Life for these imperial concubines was a non-stop cycle of grooming, medical checks, and psychological games. Every morning started with hours of preparation, bathing, hairstyling, and whatever else was needed to keep them in perfect condition. Palace doctors examined them daily, not out of concern, but to make sure they were always ready for use. Competition among the boys was fierce. The emperors encouraged this, knowing that desperate, isolated children were less likely to form alliances or resist. Punishments for failing to meet expectations were brutal and often public, ranging from humiliation to reassignment to even worse roles elsewhere in the imperial system. The emperors didn't just keep this abuse private. Sometimes they forced boys to perform in front of visiting dignitaries or high-ranking officials, turning their exploitation into a public display of absolute power. It was a chilling reminder that in Rome, no one, not even the most vulnerable, was safe from the whims of the powerful. For those who survived long enough to age out of the emperor's interest, usually around 20, their troubles were far from over. Unlike household concubines, who might eventually be freed or assigned new duties, former imperial concubines carried a stigma that made normal life impossible. Most remained trapped in the palace system, working in lesser roles and struggling with the psychological scars of their past. The normalization of these practices is evident in the records that have survived, palace documents, letters, and even historical accounts that treat the whole system as just another perk of imperial power. It's a stark reminder of how deeply embedded these horrors were in Roman society, and how easily cruelty can become invisible when it's woven into the fabric of everyday life. Among the most disturbing chapters in the story of Roman male concubinage was the widespread practice of systematic castration, a brutal, irreversible act that combined exploitation with permanent physical mutilation. For the Roman elite, this wasn't just about control. Castration was a way to ensure that their property remained youthful, compliant, and, in their eyes, perpetually desirable. The boys who underwent this procedure, sometimes as young as 8, were transformed not just in body, but in every aspect of their existence, stripped of any hope for a normal future. The methods used for castration varied, depending on the resources of the owner and the outcome they wanted. Wealthier Romans might hire trained physicians who used bronze surgical instruments and opium to dull the pain. But even with the best care available at the time, the mortality rate was staggering, between 30 and 50%. For every boy who survived, another died from blood loss, infection, or shock. The most common technique involved crushing or removing the testicles while leaving the penis intact, which prevented the onset of puberty and kept the boy's appearance and voice childlike. This was done not for medical reasons, but purely to maintain the boy's market value and appeal. There were even more extreme forms of castration, where all external genitalia were removed, creating what Romans called smooth boys. These children were considered the most valuable of all, fetching prices 3 to 5 times higher than their intact counterparts. But the risks were even greater. Mortality rates for these procedures could reach 70%. Those who survived faced lifelong medical complications, chronic pain, difficulty urinating, and severe psychological trauma from their disfigurement. The economic motivation behind all this was clear. Castrated boys couldn't father children, so there were no worries about inheritance or scandal, and their arrested development kept them marketable for years longer than other concubines. Escape, for these boys, was nearly impossible. Roman law required all free citizens to help capture runaways, and concubines had no legal status, no money, and nowhere to go. Most attempts ended in recapture within days, followed by brutal punishments designed to break the spirit of any would-be escapee. These punishments were deliberately public and severe: beatings, branding, starvation, confinement in underground cells, and sometimes mutilation, cutting off fingers or toes to make an example of the rebellious. The message was clear: resistance would only make things worse. For some boys, the only escape was suicide. Ancient sources record cases of concubines who chose death over continued abuse, using hanging, drowning, poison, or self-inflicted wounds. Occasionally, groups of boys would band together in coordinated suicide attempts, supporting each other in this final act of defiance. Very rarely a boy might escape with help from a sympathetic household member. But the risks for anyone caught helping were enormous: loss of property, status, or even their own lives. A handful of concubines found freedom during times of war, slipping away in the chaos and sometimes joining the military to secure a new identity. But these stories were the exception, not the rule. Legally, these boys had almost no protection. Roman law treated them as property, not people, and the few legal remedies available were rarely enforced. Owners could do almost anything they wanted, so long as it didn't disrupt public order or offend the sensibilities of the elite. The law might step in if an owner killed a concubine in a particularly public or gruesome way, but most abuses were simply ignored. The tide only began to turn with the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Early Christian leaders condemned the exploitation of children and slaves, challenging the deep-seated Roman belief that power and property were inseparable. Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century marked the first real legal challenge to male concubinage, although his reforms mainly protected Christian children and didn't abolish the practice outright. The Theodosian Code, established in 438 CE, went further, making castration of slaves a capital offense. But enforcement was inconsistent and the practice lingered on for generations. Christian bishops and theologians, like John Chrysostom and Augustine of Hippo, argued that all humans had inherent worth, directly contradicting the Roman view of slaves as mere property. These new ideas slowly began to undermine the cultural foundations of male concubinage. Still, wealthy Romans resisted, and many Christian emperors compromised by allowing existing arrangements to continue even as they banned new acquisitions. This meant the practice faded gradually, rather than disappearing overnight. Religious communities started to offer sanctuary to former concubines, hiding them from their owners and helping them build new lives. But this was dangerous work. Anyone caught aiding a runaway risked severe punishment. Economic changes in the later empire also played a role. As Rome's wealth dwindled and military pressures mounted, fewer families could afford the luxury of maintaining collections of boys. The market for concubines shrank, and the institution slowly withered away, though traces of it persisted into the Byzantine period. Despite the efforts of reformers, the deep cultural roots of this exploitation meant that change was slow and incomplete. The story of Rome's male concubines is a chilling reminder of how societies can normalize cruelty, turning the suffering of the vulnerable into a routine part of daily life. Even as new values took hold, the scars of this system lingered for centuries, both in the lives of survivors and in the cultural memory of the empire. The legacy of Rome's male concubine system didn't just vanish overnight. Even as Christianity spread and the laws began to change, the cultural scars ran deep. Many Romans continued to see nothing wrong with the old ways, and for generations, the stories of these boys were swept under the rug, treated as embarrassing footnotes or, worse, as curiosities in ancient gossip columns. The transition away from institutionalized exploitation was slow, uneven, and often resisted by those who stood to lose the most, Rome's wealthiest and most powerful families. As the empire fractured and new powers rose, the fate of former concubines varied dramatically. Some, especially those who had served in the imperial household, were left stranded as the palace system collapsed. With no skills, no family, and no social standing, many drifted into poverty or became dependent on the charity of the church. Religious communities, especially monasteries, sometimes offered sanctuary, but even here, the adjustment was brutal. Boys who had known nothing but servitude and abuse struggled to adapt to lives of quiet prayer and manual labor. The trauma didn't simply fade with time. It lingered, shaping their relationships, their sense of self, and their ability to trust others. Historical records from the late Empire and early Byzantine periods show that, while the open slave markets for concubines faded, underground networks persisted. Some wealthy families continued to acquire boys in secret, using bribery and influence to avoid the new Christian laws. In the provinces far from the reach of imperial edicts, old habits died hard. It wasn't until the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the rise of new legal systems that the practice was finally stamped out, at least in public. But even as the institution died, its echoes remained in Roman culture. Literature, art, and even law codes bore traces of the old system. Satirical poets continued to reference the delicate boys of Rome, sometimes with nostalgia, sometimes with biting criticism. Legal documents from the Byzantine era still contained loopholes and ambiguous language about the status of household servants, a legacy of centuries of exploitation. The trauma experienced by generations of boys became a silent undercurrent in Roman and early Christian society, rarely discussed but never fully forgotten. Modern historians have only recently begun to confront the full horror of Rome's concubine system. For centuries, scholars focused on the empire's achievements, its architecture, its legal innovations, its art, while glossing over the realities of its darkest institutions. It's only in the last few decades that researchers have sifted through the surviving records, piecing together the stories of the boys who lived and died in the shadows of Roman greatness. The evidence is chilling, not just for what it reveals about the past, but for what it says about the dangers of unchecked power and the normalization of cruelty. Rome's male concubines were victims of a system that saw them as objects, not people, a system that was able to flourish because society, law, and culture all conspired to look the other way. Today, their stories serve as a stark warning. They remind us that even the most celebrated civilizations can harbor unspeakable horrors, and that progress is never as simple or as linear as we like to imagine. The legacy of Rome's concubines is a call to remember the victims who rarely make it into the history books, to question the myths we tell about the past, and to recognize the human cost of power wielded without compassion or restraint. In the end, the story of Rome's greatest shame isn't just about what happened behind closed doors 2,000 years ago. It's about the dangers of forgetting, of letting cruelty become routine, and of allowing the powerful to define what is and isn't acceptable. It's a reminder that history is more than the triumphs of emperors and generals. It's also the suffering of those whose voices were silenced, whose lives were stolen, and whose stories demand to be told. If you found this exploration eye-opening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into the hidden sides of history. And remember, the past isn't just about what we choose to celebrate, it's also about what we choose to confront.